Mirrors can be mazes. Labyrinths live in faces. Underlying influences often escape us. Subterranean forces that help or hinder remorse. How much of our behavior is free will or set course? Concealed core conditions, biological impositions, cognitive crutches and adopted superstitions, prenatal persuasions, cultural codes, subliminal priming, or if penance is owed. Self-confirmed biases masked as rational sense, or any number of other influential elements. Take oxytocin, that's been boasting about the brilliance of brethren while belittling and brandishing the other as irrelevant. Add some insulin-induced intolerant disgust and amygdaloid paranoid fear to kill trust for a culture of conquest that exploits to exist and invalidates souls that dare to resist. See, about every genocide relied on pseudo-speciation, deep otherness mythologized, a dehumanization, a breakdown of bonds, a building of barriers, cancel community, assemble aircraft carriers. You know that. Can't feed the poor, but can fund a war. Priorities set to kicking down doors, kids under arrest for shot in a drawer, while legalized murder wins rounds of applause. But just as myths can draw out our worst, they have the potential to foster and birth new concepts of kinship that far override colonial tactics that conquer divides. Cooperative compounds, coexisting concepts, collaboration considering collective context. The realms of possibility ripple out from our position. Will the end of this way of life be our unmaking or our mission? Deliberate diverting to doing things differently, or drift into multiple global system failures and all ensuing unpleasantries. No one can do that alone, nor do we need to. Rehumanizing creates allies and more perspectives to see through. A system for the many can't be built by a few. It's from societies of seeds that the forests grew. We influence this world, and vice versa is true. So, let's organize one that helps our best shine through.
And I have the great pleasure of visiting our next speaker in Ireland earlier this year at his studio. And he is the most remarkable painter. And we would so have loved to have had one of his huge works in this show today, and unfortunately was not able to do that. They do have a material presence that is difficult to see online, so if you're ever in Ireland or you have the chance to see his work in person, I highly recommend it. And please welcome Conor Walton.
Thank you very much. Right. When I was invited to talk here, I thought I'd give a talk about what I do, but then I realized that I was leading the conversation, and I thought, no, I don't want to set myself up either as a model or as a target. So I thought I would try and propose some provocative thoughts, essentially, and try and set out some ideas and raise questions. Because I've got a lot to get through, some of them at this point will be rhetorical questions. So if you have questions, we may have to deal with it a bit later. But there are two concepts that I've been sort of mulling over and thinking about in my work. One is the concept of asymmetrical warfare and how it applies to the arts. And the other is dancing along cultural fault lines. And I had a show recently in Ireland called Asymmetrical Warfare. This is the poster for it. Just giving my work a little bit plug. And this section is called A Painter of Our Time. Now, I've put a question mark there because I'm sort of wondering about that. Can I stand up here as a painter of our time? What does that mean? This is one of my pictures. As you can see, I'm a fairly traditional sort of oil painter. You might call a sort of an old masterish sort of traditional oil painter. And it isn't the most fashionable type of work, particularly in relation to what's seen as the contemporary art scene. But this picture, I hope you can see, there's a gorilla taking a photograph. It's sort of a self-portrait with myself in a sort of 17th century style, and I've put a gorilla painting, or a gorilla taking a photograph. The gorilla is Coco, a gorilla. Her picture was on the cover of the National Geographic back in the 1970s, and it always struck me as an interesting question for a painter, essentially. When a gorilla can take a photograph, when a monkey can take a photograph, why would we paint a picture using what is essentially much more primitive technology? And that's a question I think we all have to answer in some ways. A lot of what I think, I'm going to talk in sort of very macro terms here about, I think, some of the problems that we face in terms of locating our work in the modern world. And a lot of the issues were first brought up by Walter Benjamin in his essay, The Work of Art in the Age of Mechanical Reproduction. And I think it's an issue, the issue of the work of art in the age of mechanical reproduction isn't something that a lot of artists have really still come to terms with. It's not something that I think has been really updated in terms of Benjamin's thinking. But I am going to basically make a few propositions about the way the world works today in relation to the arts. One is that, our notion of art, fine art, painting and sculpture, rests on a set of assumptions several centuries out of date. The fine arts as a group were put together in the late 17th, early 18th century and have not fully been updated. In that, if you go to an art college today, it's still, fine art still is what it was in the days of Beaux-Arts. And I don't think that's really legitimate at this point. Even when extended via avant-garde redefinitions to include fine art photography, conceptual installation art, performance art, this still covers a small fraction of cultural production, measured by numbers employed, market share, cultural influence, just generally what people are consuming. Painting and sculpture is a very small section of it. the most influential forms of visual art and figurative art in our time are movies and television. And that, our relationship to that huge industry is inevitably tangential and to some extent marginal. And the latest thing that we have to deal with, I think, is that Google and Facebook algorithms increasingly dictate what the public sees. If you want to look something up, you Google, what do you get? Google the most beautiful painting, and this is what comes up. Now, there are all sorts of reasons for this. You could construct a conspiracy theory that, the painter of this person is, spending a fortune on advertising and pushing their work up the Google rankings. Or someone else is doing it. But it is largely, I think, a product of the algorithm itself and of, you might say, the popular taste or the taste of people and the feedbacks between what people want to see or think they want to see and what they get to see. Google is blind. The bots are blind. They can't see or interpret images. They can only, if you Google in the most beautiful painting, if you type that in, it will only, Google will only show you things that have been tagged or described in those terms. So this is a problem for us just in getting through to the public. You could be producing the most amazing work, but if you're not in some way in control of the technology, you're submerged. So it's also, as an aside, the modern notion that there's no disputing about tastes, de gustibus non disputandum est. This is sort of the reductio ad absurdum, I think, of that argument. And maybe we do have to start disputing about tastes, and maybe we do need to exhume some older philosophical notions of beauty, which maybe this work doesn't entirely conform to. So, on the other side, in terms of we have the issues in terms of the problems the world faces us with, and then we have our response to it. And I think a big problem in the figurative art world and the representational art world is denial. Denial about what the problems are and the way the world works today. I've been to track, I haven't been to face, but I've heard about it. And what I've heard is that, both these, one might be forgiven for thinking that the moving image had never been invented. The painting and sculpture are treated as the representational arts rather than minor examples of the latter. Now, when I say minor, 500 years ago, painting was a big deal. It was the dominant art form. It's not the dominant art form anymore. It's really minor. It is of relatively small interest to a relatively niche audience, and that's what we see here. You might also think that the Industrial Revolution hadn't happened and that our lives weren't dominated by the technology of cheap production and reproduction. And we're still making things, painters are making pictures by hand, using essentially Stone Age technology. It's, mixing dirt into a paste and sticking it onto a flat surface with, a stick with hairs on the end of it. It's very, very primitive technology. It's changed, it's advanced in small ways, but only in small ways. The craft element of it, as time, still dominates. So figurative art occupies a tiny cultural niche. It's marginal, it's almost without impact or influence, and it's threatened with almost total irrelevance. When was the last time a work of art made the headlines for anything other than who bought it or how much it was sold for. You know, for the vast majority of people out there, for the layman, they're only, you know, the only thing that fascinates them about painting is how, you know, a bit of fabric, you know, stretched over a few pieces of wood could be so valuable. It doesn't connect with most people. I'm sure you've all had that taxi conversation, you know, so why is the Mona Lisa so famous? You know, why is, you know, a ruined Leonardo worth 450 million or whatever it is? But the outside world doesn't see what we're doing, essentially. And cleaving to a handicraft mentality, I think we are essentially fighting a war with bows and arrows, while the enemy is armed with the latest weapons. Now, when I say the enemy, I don't mean the avant-gardists or any sort of, you know, ideological opponents. I'm just talking about the people that we're essentially competing with for the attention of the public. I think people in the representational art community can be too quick to believe that someone is stealing their fire, you know, that if only we could get rid of the avant-gardists, you know, and the abstract artists, we'd be in the top position, you know, and it's bullshit. So this is my suggestion to you. This is us, okay? We are the little tribe of representational artists, figurative artists, and we're, you know, dreaming of, you know, beating the white man and taking back our land. It's not going to happen, okay? We're on the reservation. And we have to, in some sense, I think, accommodate that reality and move on and not imagine that we're ever going to go back to the 1500s when artists were superstars and were courted by, you know, royalty and, you know, because there was no competition back then. Now, we're not the only ones in denial. And this is something that we have to factor in about our whole civilization, essentially, our whole culture. Have any of you heard of the limits of growth? It was a book that was published in the early 1970s, and basically a bunch of social scientists and computer scientists got together with one of the first supercomputers, and they tried to build a model of our civilization, essentially. Model with very few inputs. You know, industrial production, resources, agricultural output, you know, just essentially the contents of our planet as they were being processed through our civilization. And when they ran this model, it always crashed. Essentially, the civilization crashed early in the 21st century. And this is a version of it where you can see resources, births, deaths, food per capita, pollution. You can see this this is 2000, so somewhere around 2025, it's saying big problem. The whole thing turns to spaghetti. Now, the only way they were able to run the computer model and it not crash was this is back in the 70s, taking our whole economy over to a no-growth model. That didn't happen. This was it was sort of, at the time it was roundly, well, it shocked a lot of people. It became one of the keys to the environmental movement, but it was also dismissed by the mainstream economists. Now, an updated version of that was recently produced by New Scientist magazine, and they tried to model, with real inputs of what's happened since the 1970s, to see how well the model was holding up, the computer model was holding up. And it's not perfect, but most of the tracks are online. The main divergences are births and deaths, where the number of births went down more than they expected, and the number of deaths went down as well. But more or less everything was still reasonably on track with the original supposition. And this is sort of an updated version of it, again running things through the computer model. And again, you can see, fairly early in the 21st century, you get a crisis. Now, this isn't a popular point of view, and of course it's just a model, okay? But it's interesting to think about how we locate ourselves in the world and how plausible this sort of crisis could be. Because if you want to think about it, here is the First World War. Here's the First World War, here's the Second World War. As you can see, they make very little difference. You'd hardly see a dent in the population figures or anything like that for that period. And you're talking about a big crisis if this were to happen. Now, let me propose to you that the crisis in this is actually ongoing, and it will unfold over the next 100 years. Back in 2009, we had sort of a major heart attack in the financial system, and it nearly brought much of the economy to the edge of collapse. And what the authorities essentially did at that point was they took extreme action and essentially put the defibrillator on the patient and got the insulin injection out and, gave a shock to the financial system, pumped in the medicine, and got the patient's heart going again. And the patient's heart is going, it's still beating, but one isn't necessarily clear whether the patient hasn't suffered irreparable brain damage. Okay? Now, I think if you were to look at current politics, you might conclude that maybe the patient has suffered irreparable brain damage. Trump, Brexit, the collapse of consensus politics, polarization that's going on is a sign of things going wrong in our whole political world, our whole philosophical world. And this is something that I think we have to think about. If this model is right, what we've experienced so far is only a taste of what's to come. Okay? So if you think Trump is an aberration, he may be just the hors d'oeuvre compared to what's coming down the line. And if that's the case, we have to think about how we locate ourselves in this environment, because it's not like maybe people might like to think of sort of a goodies and baddies where the enemy can be vanquished. The enemy may not be vanquished, and we may have to, at some level, accommodate the enemy. So this is something to think about, just in terms of what we're going into. if we're going into a long, extended crisis. Now, it's not like I'm not a sort of a doomer and sort of the end of the world. It's going to happen, tomorrow or next week or anything like that. But I would suggest that one serious possibility that you have to deal with over the next, over our lifetimes, is that it will unfold as a series of crises and partial recoveries, but perhaps on a downward slope. So this is something that I think we need to maybe come to terms with and at least start thinking about. Now, in a society that is in some way in deep crisis or in secular decline, you might think to look to the arts for signs of decadence. Okay, and I don't mean decadence necessarily as a moral judgment. I mean it almost in a technical way, that a society that is struggling past its peak in intellectual decline and possibly in decline in other ways, will manifest its illnesses and the distortions of its spirit in the arts. And I propose to you that, post the notion of, modernist progress, which has been the dominating narrative of art over the 20th century, that we might begin to look at that again and maybe see if there's a different story that could be told about the unfolding of art over the last 2 centuries. And to some extent, it is already there in the art history, because from the point of the French Revolution on, you get essentially the polarization of art into 2 camps, progressives and reactionaries or decadents, and a huge argument going on. David starts it off with the sort of, claiming the revolutionary mantle, but his students accused him of being Boucher, Rococo, Madame Pompadour. In other words, essentially a decadent. And the neoclassicists, while denouncing their opponents as, decadent, were also denounced as decadent. And you get this pattern, where the Romantics play with the notion of decadence, where the Impressionists are denounced as decadent, but also use the concept themselves. Pissarro accuses Gauguin of decadence, and Gauguin accuses Pissarro of decadence. And the same version of the conversation is going right up to Picasso, who called Bonnard not really a modern painter, a decadent, the end of an old idea. Now, I think the concept of decadence is really interesting. If you unearth any sort of notion of a philosophy of history, that history has a path and we're going along it, it has a meaning that I think we need to look at. And I think we need to look at whether what we do, not really modern, a decadent, the end of an old idea, whether that applies to what we're doing. Okay? Are we decadents in some sense? Do we manifest the spiritual malaise of our time in our work? Should we? Should we actually use this as a model to think about where we are in history? So, in terms of why cleave to an obsolete, what you might call, in terms of the modern suite of technological ways of producing work, why cleave to still mixing paint and putting it on a canvas is really labor-intensive way of working that really limits our audience. I think there are certain reasons why we can do that. I wanted to put the other side of the story, having been very negative. One is authenticity. Now, that's a big word and a lot of concepts lie behind it. I'm not going to get into those right now, but I want to put it out there that authenticity is a concept that is important to us and that we care about, okay? It's about doing something with conviction and doing something that in some way, that things that aren't easy, taking the difficult route has its rewards. The other is economic. In an era of cheap, abundant reproduction, the unique handmade original work of art has extraordinary value. Now, we may all complain about the value that we get, the price that we get for our work. But, broadly speaking, it's feasible today, even at the lower end of the market, to sell a painting for the price of a used car or for the price of, one of these things. And, it might take you a week's work, 2 weeks' work. Could you make one of these in a week? Anyone? Could you make a used car in a week? You're not exchanging like for like here. The machinery of our world makes most things really cheap and really complicated things really cheap. And that allows value to migrate to other places, and particularly it migrates to the unique work of art. So we can sell things, even things that are sort of almost produced running entirely against the grain of modern technological society. You can sell things, you can make a living out of it. Some of us are living proof of the strangeness of that situation. The other is that the more the work is reproduced, the more valuable the original becomes. So I know a lot of people get worried about copyright and copyright infringement and whether their pictures are produced in China and all that sort of thing. I don't think that's a big issue for us. Generally speaking, the more copies we can get, the more we can put out there, the better we do. And the internet is a great way of essentially distributing images for free. And if we can make our work ubiquitous, it drives up the value of the original. So in that way, the original work of art becomes like a seed surrounded by a big sort of fruit of digital copies. The digital copies are what is easy for the mass audience to consume and digest. The seed is sort of contained within that. Now, whereas traditional art world is hierarchical and depends on a sort of a ritualistic space like the gallery, the ritualistic, the priest, curator, the work of art as an icon or a relic that is almost treated with a reverence and a quasi-religious attitude of worshipfulness. The internet can allow us to some extent circumvent that very hierarchical system, very much based in physical spaces and museum spaces, and particularly a world like in the official art world. Let's say power resides in a relatively small number of hands. If you get a great critic to write you up, or a great gallerist to take you on, or a great museum to buy your work, you're made. Outside of that golden circle, it's hard. But the technology is now allowing the means for essentially spontaneous networks and to produce work that will reach a wide audience, totally bypassing the mainstream media and totally bypassing the curatoriate. And that's really useful. And that also reopens the door to cultural influence. Because if we can get our work out there, if we can produce, memes, viral content, if we can use digital technology to promote our work, potentially the world's our oyster. Now, this opens the notion of asymmetrical warfare. This is a self-portrait. That's me up riding the dinosaur, and that to some extent is how I conceive of my art. It's a dinosaur, but it has teeth. And in imagination, in conception, you can ride it into battle. You can take on the forces against you. Now, asymmetrical warfare is defined as war between belligerents whose strength, strategy, and tactics differ significantly. It's like war between a professional army and insurgents. It has obvious relevance to a whole range of modern conflicts, like particularly Afghanistan, Iraq, Syria. I'm from Ireland. The Irish were essentially the first to take on the British Empire and win. And it was done with like a few thousand badly armed, not even soldiers. My grandparents were out fighting. My paternal grandfather was 16, and his parents tried to stop him going out by taking his trousers. But he kicked up such a hullabaloo that they gave them back. They gave him back his trousers, and he went out. But that sort of sense of what you can do, taking on a big adversary, I think should be inspiring. Now, lessons. I think we need to accept to some extent the marginality of our enterprise. And that what we are doing is countercultural. We can leverage aspects of painting which can form a critique of the dominant culture: authenticity versus simulation, truth versus power, tradition versus novelty, proximity to nature versus alienation. Don't be fooled into imagining that history's on our side. It's probably not, but we can have fun along the way, and maybe make a difference. But the notion of the avant-garde, I don't think is available to us anymore. The avant-garde was this forward force, and the idea was that the masses were going to come, the heavy artillery were going to come along behind. The heavy artillery may not come along behind to back us up. But we can still have fun. And I think if we think tactically, like someone engaged in guerrilla warfare or facing long odds, to think like a terrorist or subversive, we have ways of doing things. Now, I'm not necessarily trying to push you into actual terrorism or subversion. I'm not necessarily trying to push you into radical politics. If you want to, be my guest. But I think you have to recognize our marginality here. If we were into radical politics, say we were some little alt-right group here, we would probably be infiltrated by the intelligence services. Are the intelligence services here? Okay. Our phones would be bugged. Our conversations recorded. Do you think the intelligence services are interested in what we're doing? They're not. They regard us as totally harmless and irrelevant. Now, what I'm suggesting to you is that's an opportunity, because they're not looking at what we're doing. So, if you think like a subversive, you could get away maybe with a lot of stuff that a real subversive couldn't. So, just to give an example, Banksy, like this whole sort of Scarlet Pimpernel business with Banksy. Who is he? And, we seek him here, we seek him there. what he's doing at the level of politics is not that radical, it's not that subversive. But then he can put a picture into auction and sells for 10 million, you know? Like devolved government. Is it a masterpiece? No. But he's walking all the way to the bank, and he has totally adopted the methods and the mentality and the image of the subversive. So I think our invisibility to the existing power structures means that potentially we can get away with stuff as long as we're prepared to accept and see that we are actually invisible. You know, that you can produce a masterpiece, no one's going to beat your door down to come looking at it. You have to go out there. You have to do something with it. How's time? Have I gone?
We just enjoy you so much. We're not in the time.
Okay, just a few big lessons, okay? Like what I take away from just in terms of the rousing motivational stuff at the end, what I think is really important beyond all the marketing of the work, we still need to have a core that justifies. I think we still need to embody excellence in what we do, the old-fashioned way. We need to embody wisdom, okay? And that's maybe a more difficult thing to do, especially when the world is going crazy around us. But I think, again, that needs to be, for me, it's a core, that there is some sort of wisdom, you know, and maybe it may be a strange sort of wisdom, you know. It's like when the kings are mad, fools need to be sane in some sense. And our position may be playing the fool to power in an almost Lear-like way. Address real issues, okay? Don't get stuck up in the ivory tower. Try to connect with an audience. Make your work a revelation. Try to reveal something important. That, you know, and I think the best way to think about this in my terms is, what do I really care about? And what really bothers me, you know? What are my problems? What am I divided about? And to try to plumb those dark areas. And there's a quote that I love by a French philosopher called Fontenelle. Madmen we are, but not quite on the pattern of those who are shut up in a madhouse. It does not concern any of them to discover what sort of madness afflicts his neighbor or the previous occupants of his cell. But it matters very much to us. The human mind is less prone to go astray when it gets to know to what extent and in how many directions it is itself liable to err. And we can never devote too much time to the study of our aberrations. Now, that to me is, you know, in a crazy world, that is the great argument for imaginative art. And that it unlocks what is inside our heads, essentially, and can bring into view what no camera can capture, because the camera only captures the external. That it can conjure up images from inside us and reveal something of what is going on in ourselves personally, but also within our collective psyche. So I think one of the great themes of art, and why studying art and paying attention to the art of the past is really important, is that it reveals to us a humanity that we wouldn't otherwise be able to access. So, dancing along cultural fault lines, my work, I'm dealing with cultural conflict. the crises of our times, political, ecological, financial, cultural, moral, the warped perspectives that ensue. I try to dance along the cultural fault line, which is essentially to sort of thread a path through a polarized world, a world of conflicting perspectives, using fantasy, humor, playfulness, irony, the feigned craziness of the court jester, to articulate serious issues in a manner that is both challenging and mercurial, that allows and even facilitates multiple interpretations. And the multiple interpretation issue is very important to me because I want to be able to find work that can engage with a whole variety of audiences in a whole variety of ways. And that, because our cultural world is fragmented and our political world is fragmented. And to find a way to navigate that and span some of the barriers, I think that is potentially an important function for the imaginative arts today. My intention is to present the intelligent viewer aware of contrary-interpretive possibilities, questions and dilemmas. What's going on here? Which interpretation to choose? Whose side is the artist on? Is he joking or serious? Is he crazy or sane? Is this satire or paranoid fantasy? My hope is that the intelligent viewer, aware that different interpretive possibilities cannot be removed, that the picture cannot thus be easily used as propaganda by either side or easily disarmed and rendered innocuous, is led towards a more complex and nuanced negotiation with the image. The viewer's own interpretive responsibilities must be acknowledged. The implicit threat to the viewer's interpretation and supporting worldview remains. In an age of crisis and revolutionary politics, the imaginative arts typically acquire renewed force and vigor and command our attention because they can reveal what is going on deep in our collective psyches and beneath the surface of our culture. Now, that, I think, is what we're actually seeing. You know, I think the imaginative arts are showing a rejuvenation, renewed force. But I would tie that directly to the decline of contemporary politics, that the two are actually connected, and that flowering in the imaginative arts is actually a correlative and, to some extent, a consequence of the decline of our politics, because it particularly happens when authority proves weak, fallible, and deluded. What we find in the depths can and perhaps should be shocking. And perhaps that is the context in which we need to look at the 20th century, the art of the 20th century, that to some extent we should not normalize the art of the last 100 years, that we should still be shocked or disturbed by what we see in that work. So I'm, to some extent, trying to exemplify the madness of my time in my work in a way that makes it easier for other people to understand. This is one example of my work. This is called Four Horsemen. It illustrates a few things that I suppose I'm dealing with here. One is its connection with popular culture. Okay, I'm going straight into popular culture and grabbing a well-known icon to create what is in some ways a meme, but putting it within a context of the apocalypse, so that it becomes to some extent like an allegory of current American politics. Sort of the slide into craziness that we see with the rise of Trump and other stuff. And it's a way of communicating, okay? Grabbing something that the audience, that a wide audience, of the last 30 years who've grown up on Toy Story movies, can readily understand, identify with. There's the joy of recognition that gives an immediate satisfaction, and then what's going on here. And then the title, which puts it in a context of, doom, apocalypse, revelation. My painting of Donald Trump, which is called Novus Ordo Seclorum, this sort of got me into trouble, and I have to say I enjoyed it, but it was, the starting point was a conversation I listened to on Facebook, or watched on Facebook, which is who's going to paint President Trump's official portrait. And all the big portrait names in America seem to be saying, oh, not me, I'm not going to do it, career suicide, wouldn't touch that with a barge pole. And I thought, well, is there a way to do this where you could, maybe satisfy the man's vanity, please his supporters, and yet make a subversive comment? And I thought of Conan the Barbarian as sort of a model that could be used, that would be very true to the pop culture or low culture base that supports Trump. This macho world of aggression and passive women that is sort of a really strong thread in American popular culture, and you see in the Hollywood movies and all the rest, and it was on all the fantasy art book covers and that. And I thought this is an interesting way of sort of locating Trump culturally and maybe making a statement. And I put this out on April 1st. It was in a show that opened on March 31st in Ventura as part of the Track Conference. And what I agreed with Michael Pierce, who ran it, was that we would tweet that the morning of April 1st. And I put out, thrilled and honored to paint President Trump's official portrait, flying to Washington for the unveiling, and put it out, and it died on Twitter. It didn't go on Twitter, but it went kaboom on Facebook and Instagram. And again, this is sort of, I got a huge range of responses to this painting. People on the left who loved it, who thought it was brilliant satire. People on the left who thought that I was glorifying Trump. People on the right who thought I was being derogatory about the president, and people on the right who thought it was really funny. But it got that sort of, people could take it in different ways. That is what I'm talking about a little bit, my idea of dancing along the cultural fault line, of producing work that is to some extent ideologically indestructible maybe, and that it can withstand view from alternative perspectives rather than be disposable as propaganda. Okay.
So thank you, Conor, for a fascinating talk, and that has raised so many different questions. I think I can't latch onto all of them, but this idea of the marginality of painting, drawing, sculpture, and the potential that opens up for subversion. I think also something you said, which was, should we manifest the spiritual malaise in our work? And finally, I'm really interested in this idea of the mercurial and multiple interpretations, which links to what we were talking about before, which is the need to renegotiate and adapt. So I'm going to start off by looking at this idea of manifesting the spiritual malaise in our work, or engaging with the social and political context of our work. and looking at the different ways in which that might take place. You've raised really interesting examples in your own work of how you're doing it at the moment, and at the moment we're actually joined by Paul Branford, Charmaine Watkis, Wendy Elia, who are three of the exhibiting artists here. So I'd like to open up the discussion to also how that's something that you negotiate in your own work. Wendy, I'm going to start off with you, if that's all right. In your work, you integrate lots of different references from art history, from the personal histories of your sitters, and lots of different symbolism. And I'm interested in how you weave all of those together and how you choose the symbolism and what symbolism becomes relevant to each work that you're putting together.
Right, okay, can you hear me? So my work is the one on the end there, which was, I suppose, a celebration of migration into this country and mixed race. All of those ladies are Londoners. This was painted about over 10 years ago now. So, and quite a few of them are relatives. So it was my attempt to celebrate what was around me. I was born and raised in London. I have lots of London friends, and we are very mixed race, class, and, you know, this is my life. I paint my friends and my family. But I wanted to somehow put in some political aspects, which is tricky, without being overt, without being preachy. So, as you were saying, using signifiers or symbols. So, for example, on the mantelpiece is a rubber bullet that was picked up from Ireland during the Troubles by a member of the Socialist Workers' Party. And if you think of the history of the rubber bullet, it was actually invented in England and developed and has been sold, you know, all over the world ever since as a means to control the crowds. And so, although this might seem like a happy scene of all of these young ladies that now, I hasten to have children of their own, quite a few of them, the power of the state has to be there, evident, in many of my paintings, and I use that little image of the rubber bullet canister with the rubber bullet. And above it is the Constable painting, so using art historical references, which we all know is this ideal of England on biscuit tins, etc. But it was actually a rage against the Industrial Revolution, because the scene that where he's looking from, behind it, was his father's mill as he painted it. So also, you'll notice through the windows there are security cameras, which are always looking at us, and did so 10 years ago. I think I first started using them in my work 20 years ago. This idea that as we watch, they watch us, and we watch each other to a certain extent. So it's a tricky business, isn't it? Because I think Conor does it really quite successfully in a way by reaching out using the kind of images that people would recognize, like Conan the Barbarian and things like that, to sort of make a statement about something. Whereas mine are much more hidden, I suppose, and they require some time, like a poem would require some time to read and digest. Whereas I think yours are possibly more immediate.
So a lot of the work also is that navigation between the personal and the political, the way you maneuver that, the way you decide to maybe subvert the content, appropriate content, change it around, work with mass media, images, and I'm quite interested in the different movements that takes place in your own work. So I'm going to, both Paul and Charmaine, I think, and Wendy, I think it mixes a lot in the work that's in the show. There are elements of the personal, elements of the political, the more immediate, the more mass media. And Charmaine, you said recently that you actually work in a way which is from the inside out. And I'm really interested about that idea. So could you explain a little bit more about it?
For me, I think it's important to kind of see what's inside that wants to come out. I do a lot of research for my work, and I kind of get an idea of the kind of thing that I want to research, but after I've absorbed all of that information, I then kind of connect with what I really want to say inside. So I tend to want to evoke some kind of emotion through the work. I mean, the work that I've got in the show here, I didn't have to do any research for that because I made that work about my parents' generation who came to this country to help rebuild post-war Britain. And I made it a couple of years before the Windrush scandal, because at the time I thought that no one was saying anything about my parents' generation. And I was inspired to make that by, I found my mother's passport, and I opened up the passport, and it said, there's a line that says, to allow the bearer to move freely without hindrance or let, and to afford the bearer protection and as where necessary. And I felt that that wasn't the case with my parents' generation. And so it started with that idea of what could I say about my parents' generation, and I had to then go inside and really, it's almost like really relive those memories. But I also had to intersperse memories of my generation and my friends' generation who were born here. Because my work, even though it touches on the personal, I tend to open it out to talk about a collective experience. And if I tap into emotion deep within, then it will go beyond that. So it's not just about my parents' generation, it's about anybody else who has migrated here, anyone who can identify with being seen as other, as being seen as outcast. So all of those things are important. So for me, I try to get to the essence of that thing that I want to say, because in that essence that lives in a heart, if you speak from here, you'll touch other people's hearts as well. So that's the way I work. And I build in layers as well. So even though this piece kind of talks about history, it also talks about the cyclical nature of history. And so we're looking now, we're faced now with the same issues back then. You know, these issues about borders, who belongs, who doesn't belong, who's British, are you really British, can you be British and black, can you be English and black, or, you know, can you be English and Italian, or, you know, all these things that are now being said yet again. And they need to be said, because if we don't keep saying them, people keep forgetting, and then we keep going around the same issue again. So yes, so that for me is the importance of going within and bringing things out that need to be said. It's like an exorcism.
Thank you. And I think that also brings up the idea of how you then create the possibility of engaging with the viewer and it having a life outside the work. So the work exists and then you provoke a response. And something that came up in Conor's talk, and I think it's very much also, I think it's the case in Paul's work as well, is this idea that the viewer has an active kind of responsibility, an active engagement. And so sometimes you're not presenting an image that's clearly positioned or clearly too demarcated. It's not just about propaganda, it's also about negotiating understanding. And Paul, in your work, I was wondering if you could talk a little bit about that.
Yeah, the top bit, that's right. Is that working yet? Yeah. I suppose what you can start with maybe is sort of different source material. Years ago, 20 years ago, I used to sort of quite avidly just cut out photos from newspapers, loads of them, boxes full of them, and that was a bit sort of like tapping into what was happening at that particular point, but also a bit like roulette. If you didn't get the paper, you would miss that image. But since sort of the internet's really taken off, you can practically, if you put the time in, you can see practically everything and collect anything. But the idea that sometimes people send stuff to me, sometimes I come across things. Obviously, the big political news, everybody's going to sort of have a look at that. Always, before making these big works, I kind of made that work for a sort of a bet, where a friend of mine insulted me in a pub, and that was, and that is a long story, but that came out of it. But before then, I was painting much smaller, sort of political portraits, if you like, and what I quite enjoyed doing was painting subjects that I didn't much like. So that almost allowed me to kind of play around to twist their face in the image that I was making, sticking my fingers in it quite a lot, gouging stuff out with the other side of the paintbrush. I was experimenting on their faces. So there's a little bit of that, figures that you recognise, a little bit with sort of playing with the materials to create something out of their face rather than simply reproduce it. What I sort of think, and again, we know where we are. We're kind of politically pretty screwed at the moment, aren't we? We're sort of stuck in some mire. It's not necessarily going to get better quickly. So when things are bad, I mean, my answer is, "Oh, sod it, let's go to the pub." So another set of images that are in that painting are basically pub photos. Me and my friends quite often kind of go to the pub and photograph each other. Then put that out with an insulting line on Twitter. You're next, Richard. So there's a lot of collections of things going on from pubs, and the third set of images are things stolen from social media. Some of the people that I've met, some of them I haven't met. Again, from various political points of view, if you like. So your political figures, your pub pictures, and your kind of internet schemers are all kind of like pulled together in a space that they never. I've done a few of these paintings now. The space never tells you anything precise about where the location is. It's almost like the people are staged. A lot of the photos I like are photos of people caught in mid-performance. You don't know what they're saying, you don't know what they're doing, and in a sense they can be quite contradictory. Somebody from the left is often balanced by somebody from the right. Oddly, and these quite like pairings of people. Somebody representing the left, somebody representing the right, somebody representing mainstream politics, somebody representing sort of the populism that we see now. Other elements of the painting are more chance, and again, when you put something open to the viewer, you have no control over what they're going to do with it. And as far as I'm concerned, that's absolutely fine. That thing was exhibited in Stockport about 18 months ago. And somebody looked at it and they thought, oh, God, he's very right. By the way, I don't consider myself hugely left-wing. I probably consider myself sort of leftish, which is fine. But somebody wrote in the comments book, oh, he's very right on, isn't he? Look at that there. Look at that. He's painting the demons of Brexit. They're not actually. What they are paintings of two cartoon characters, the Drunken Bakers, by a guy that I know, Barney Farmer, who's the tall, thin, purpley kind of guy on the side there. But what people make of it, again, you present, because the internet, isn't it, how we live now, we're bombarded with a spectrum of conflicting information. Practically none of it we can take at face value. We can't believe anything. I think it's a Putin thing. If you don't believe in anything, you will believe anything. So we're bombarded with disinformation, lies, twisted, distorted facts from all sides, and we are left in this kind of confused state, aren't we? Where we don't quite know what the hell is going on. And I sort of like sort of like try to recreate that state of affairs in paintings, if you like?
So it goes back to that idea of the multiple interpretations and the fact that actually there is always a visual ambiguity in visual languages. Is one of the exciting parts of visual languages is the fact that there is an ambiguity in the interpretation. And I think that what Conor was talking about raises this idea that things are going to be changing a hell of a lot, and things are going to be maybe in moments of crisis. They're already in moments of crisis, but it's just the beginning. And this idea of renegotiating new spaces, and the film that we saw at the beginning, is also about how we can actually confront those needing to renegotiate spaces and be adaptable, be open to ambiguity, be adaptable. And I think that the previous model has always been about trying to find answers and about certainties. And so if anybody came here to look for answers, I'm really sorry, because I think that what we're doing is actually trying to navigate renegotiating territories and ambiguities. And I think there might be a popping question up at the back there, so I might put it over there.
Okay, so the session title is Of Our Time. Sorry, where do you want me to go? Of Our Time. And our time, and you're talking about space and place, our time is the Anthropocene. Our time is really problematic. And we've talked about all kinds of bodies today. Nude bodies, anatomical bodies, fragmented bodies, machine bodies. But we are biological bodies that are changing because of human exceptionalism. This idea that there's something particularly special about us in this huge ecological system as humans, and therefore we can take and do what we want, possess, have more, etc. And all the things we've then set in motion means our bodies are full of plastic and crap, and we've got asthma and all this stuff. So in Conor's image, there's Coco. There's Coco reminding us about the dangers of really foundational beliefs, like we were talking this morning about binaries. That includes human exceptionalism. And so we're talking about the human figure, but there's got to be some discussion about the human figure in our time as not being what it has been historically.
I think in our time, I don't know what you do at home, really, but I'm just on the computer just to wind people up on the internet. So I think in this day and age, the internet is just as much a big space as whatever it is. But maybe you lot don't do that looking at me. But I think the internet is as much of our environment as the actual environment.
I just wanted to relate this back to history a bit, A Painter of Our Time, which of course was an essay by Baudelaire. And he was actually mentioning Delacroix, who wasn't truly a painter of his time, because Delacroix, although he used a kind of modern language, he was still painting classical subjects. He also used an artist who was an illustrator called Constantin Guise, the French G-U-Y-S, I don't know how you pronounce that, but who was an illustrator. And even though he was friends with Manet, who was truly a painter of his time, if you like, this idea of a painter of our time, and I think you're right, if it is truly an artist of our time, then we would be thinking Instagram, wouldn't we? And, film and telly, as you said. But if we're thinking of a painter of our time, does that mean it has to be using paint? Why are we still all using paint? I remember when I was at art school in the 80s, everyone saying painting's dead. This was, you lot are finished, was actually what was being said. And yet, I'm not going to say how many decades later, we're all still painting. So there must be something in it, and I think it's to do with our complete control over our medium, which somehow you lose that, I think, with other media to a certain extent.
I think there's a need to touch things, though, isn't there, as human beings? That's why we do it, because, whenever there's a new technology that comes out, they always say, oh, well, the old technology is dead, and that's it, everyone's got to move over to this new media. And then, after all the fuss has died down, people say, well, actually, I quite like doing this, so that's why I'm doing it. And I think it's just as simple as that. It's, it's just, that's all it is.
I'm an artist, so I'm struggling with some of the same things that you guys are struggling with. And I also am a gallerist, so I have to struggle with what audience want and what is popular. And I'm also a picture framer. And so I see someone like the beautiful painting, which was by Cerla. He's very popular. We frame absolutely tons of his work, probably making a lot of money, probably not as much as the self-styled painter of light, Thomas Kincaid, who's very popular in America, has stores all over the world, and probably earns more money from painting than any of us. But we mustn't think that the audience has to be intelligent or judge what that intelligence is, because it comes down to what we like. And I actually think that although we may not have the influence that artists once had, that actually our audience is larger than it's ever been and is growing.
Yes, my question's to Wendy, and I'm fascinated by the bird on the left with its reflection. Maybe it's an ibis, and before I saw that painting, I saw a painting at City Lit by you as well, and so I know about you. I spent a lot of time looking at that, and of course you've got an ibis and its reflection in that painting, which has only got two figures, a male and a female in it, so it's quite. So obviously, I'm curious. You may want to discuss the ibis, I hope.
Well, the ibis is a kind of symbolic bird, so when you look at it, if you don't know anything about symbolism, you see a bird that's chained to its plinth, so that in itself has some kind of signification, I guess. And a lot of my work is always stuck in interiors, and I often feel as a woman I've often been stuck in interiors because I've got 3 children. I've got 3 grandchildren as well, and so often the work is about people in a room. Also, I'm sure someone who knows Egyptian mythology, it's often found in a tomb. So it's a Victorian relic that my mother owned, that I have inherited, that just remains as a constant. There are a few items that remain as constants throughout the picture. As I get old, I should ask it for it to be put in my willow coffin, I guess. But hopefully you get something from looking at that bird and thinking, why is that in the painting?
I was just wondering if in our time we really have any boundary between the private and the public. What do you think? Because there used to be indoors, in your house you were private, but that's really broken now, isn't it?
I suppose I find it interesting now, because obviously there's social media, and that sort of can invade all aspects of our lives. And I'm also conscious, I have young children, and I have taken a sort of a fairly straight view of shielding them, essentially, from as much as possible of not using them in my work. They appear as models, but I don't use them personally in my social media feed and that sort of thing. But there is an interesting issue. I do not do an awful lot. While I produce work, for example, that I think of as political in one sense, I try my best not to foreground my own political beliefs, because I don't want people to interpret my work through that prism. So I think there are still things that, that there are still barriers that one can keep, and to some extent one needs to keep, even if they're paper walls, to some extent. I think, what was I going to say? There are issues like in terms of the age that we live in now, I tend to treat the internet, everything I do online is visible. I'm in that public sphere as nothing is hidden. You can't hide anything anymore. But I still try to preserve certain areas for myself that are totally private, partly a responsibility to others, and partly an obligation to my work to leave certain aspects of the interpretation of my work open, so that while I'm a fairly opinionated person, they don't necessarily totally dominate the reception of the work.
Elina, in your foreword in the catalogue, you mentioned this theoretical death of painting. I'd be interested to know what people you think were associated with that death and whether it's still happening.
It's such a long and convoluted death that it's difficult to, and it happened in many different ways. I think there's a theoretical death of painting that actually needs to be contextualized, and it happened after the 2 World Wars, when people were actually starting to question the validity of lots of notions that were linked to painting, ways of working, ways of representing, conventions that were happening. And even the modernist movement, which can be seen to kind of engage painting in the beginning of its end, which is looking at finding the essence of painting and what painting can do. And then actually, it's definitely the death of figuration, if you want to look at it that way. Because the idea that the essence of painting is just the relationship between figure and ground, that means that all you're left with is a mark on a surface. So this is kind of going back to the theory of Greenberg in modernism. And I think that theoretical death was also one which was about how can we talk about the world that we've just created. And so it needs to be contextualized after the world wars. So I don't necessarily have any answers. I think that going back to what came up in the last panel was also that we also like playing in the mud. We like making handprints on walls, and we enjoy the stuff of pigment and color. And so at the same time, you can have a theoretical death whilst you're still reveling in the kind of viscerality of humanity. And for me, there's the theory and then the reality of how we negotiate those spaces. I'll throw it out because it's not really, again, an answer. It's more a questioning and a research process or a discovery.
I just wanted to thank you, Conor, for the cloak of invisibility. Just the idea that we can have that power of access. And I think that identifying that was important for me.
It's not just a material thing. It's actually what that energy, that mark, comes out to the onlooker, to the environment around you. So, I mean, it can be a material object, but it's, if someone dances in front of your painting, someone cries in front of your painting, you've done something, and you don't own it. It comes straight through you. But it is to do with this energy and connection that comes through work and then goes out into the world. So whether painting is alive or dead or this or that.
Short question for Conor. That as an Irishman, do you see your position, where you positioned yourself with the craziness, close to the whole tradition of Mad Sweeney?
No, I didn't actually. It's an interesting thought. I suppose Ireland is on the edge of Europe and a small country, and there is sort of a provincial viewpoint. So I'm aware that to some extent I grew up in a cultural as far as the visual arts are concerned, what might be considered a cultural backwater and developed. And I think that served my purposes in some ways, because I think artists are slow to develop. I think that the visual artists, like I'm a slow learner, and I think a lot of visual artists often are relatively slow learners. And if you're in London and you're trying to make a name for yourself, you're under a different level of pressure. And I know gallerists have talked about, London sickness, which is essentially, a promising artist, maybe from the provinces, comes up, makes a big, splash in London, but then either can't maintain the production or can't maintain the prices or whatever else, and they go down the tubes. So I think there is an advantage sometimes to being a little bit out of the mainstream and being really sure of what you're doing before you bring it to market. But the other side is, you really do need to bring it to market and you need to get it out there.
I wasn't going to, but that links on with something that we were talking about in our group, which is public v private. And you're saying that privacy was important to your development as an artist and the way you approach your subjects. So my question on the board was, is there a difference between public art and private art? And I don't know.
I think these days, the church and state are not commissioning public art in the sense that they did in the 19th century or the 18th or the 17th, which were big public statements which were intended to represent society and make a big statement about society. That tends not to be happening. So I think the responsibility for making grand statements has to some extent devolved upon the artist and maybe defines the artist's role today, where before someone else could tell you what to do, like the Pope or the King or whoever it was could tell you what to paint, and you just did what you were told. Artists weren't expected to have a moral viewpoint or to be responsible. They just took the money and did what they were told, and that's true of Rubens or occasionally you get an artist like Michelangelo who sort of comes up with his own program, but that was relatively rare. They did what they were told. That's not a model. I don't think that's a viable model for us now. So I think it's up to us as private individuals to some extent to make public art, to make art that makes the grand statement.
It was actually from that conversation, just something popped into my head. If we take Schrodinger's cat and imagine ourselves as the cat, and we lock ourselves in a box with all our paints and our easels and our knowledge of the world outside, but once we're in the box, we're never coming out again, right? We're in there. Does that make us any less of an artist of our time?